A guy in Texas leases 4 acres of dirt behind his house to a nightclub. 18 months later, he's making more from that lease than he ever made farming the whole property. And he almost turned the offer down. Here's the part nobody tells you. The money is real, but it comes with the kind of risk that can wipe out everything you make in a single bad weekend. So is renting your land to a nightclub actually a smart investment, or a slow-motion liability disguised as easy, passive income that quietly costs you far more than it ever pays out? We pulled the actual lease numbers, the actual insurance claims, the actual tax filings, and the actual small business failure rates behind deals exactly like this one. Here's the real math nobody puts in the brochure. It starts simple. Nadia runs a mid-sized nightclub 2 towns over, and her lease is up. Her landlord sold the building to a developer, and she has 90 days to find a new location, or shut down entirely. She needs 3 acres, good road access, enough parking for 200 cars, and enough distance from residential zoning that noise complaints don't shut her down every weekend. Hank's land checks every box. 11 acres on the edge of town, right off the highway exit, zoned agricultural, and doing absolutely nothing except growing weeds and collecting a property tax bill every year. He inherited it from his father, tried farming it for 6 years, and gave up when the input costs outpaced what the crops were worth. For the last 4 years, it's just sat there, mowed twice a summer so the county doesn't cite him for overgrowth, generating exactly $0 while he pays roughly $2,400 a year in property taxes just to keep it. That's the part that made Nadia's offer land differently than it might have for someone actively farming a profitable parcel. Hank wasn't weighing a nightclub lease against a thriving business. He was weighing it against a slow, guaranteed loss every single year, with no plan to change that on his own. Nadia offers him 2 options. Option 1, a flat monthly rent, negotiated once a year, paid the same whether business is booming or dead. Option 2, a percentage of the club's gross revenue, plus a guaranteed minimum so he's never left with nothing. Most landowners, when they hear this pitch for the first time, take the flat rent. It feels safer. It feels like something they understand. It's just rent, like renting out a house. But the real money and the real risk lives in that second option, and almost nobody explains why until it's too late to matter. Let's break down how these deals actually get structured, because the numbers matter more than the concept. A flat lease for raw commercial use land near a mid-sized town typically runs somewhere between $1,500 and $4,000 a month, depending on acreage, road access, utility hookups, and how much site work the tenant has to do themselves. That's the boring number. It's predictable. It shows up every month regardless of whether the club is packed or empty. For a landowner who wants certainty, that's the entire appeal. The percentage deal works differently, and it's worth walking through exactly how Hank structured his. He negotiated 6% of gross bar and door revenue, with a guaranteed floor of $2,500 a month, meaning even in the club's slowest month, he's covered at a level close to what he'd get from a flat lease anyway. But on a strong month, when the club pulls in $180,000 in combined bar sales, cover charges, and event revenue, 6% isn't $2,500 anymore. It's nearly $11,000. In December alone, driven by holiday parties and New Year's Eve, that number can spike even higher. That's the appeal of the percentage structure. It's also the trap, because gross revenue at a nightlife venue swings hard. With the seasons, with the local economy, with gas prices affecting how far people are willing to drive, and with something as simple as one bad online review cutting foot traffic for months. A flat rent landlord doesn't feel any of that. A percentage landlord feels every bit of it, for better and for worse. There's a middle structure too, which some landowners don't even know to ask for, a stepped or tiered percentage, where the rate increases as revenue crosses certain thresholds. Under $100,000 a month, the operator pays 4%. Cross $100,000, and the rate on everything above that threshold jumps to 8%. This rewards the landowner disproportionately in strong months while keeping the floor protected in weak ones. It's more complex to negotiate, but it's often the single highest earning structure available, and very few landowners ever bring it up because they don't know it exists. Before we go further into the risk side of this, there's a financial detail that changes the entire calculation, and it rarely comes up in casual conversations about land leasing: how this income actually gets taxed. Lease income from land is generally treated as passive rental income, reported on Schedule E rather than as self-employment income. That means no self-employment tax on the rent itself, a meaningful difference compared to running an active business on that same land. But the moment a percentage of revenue structure is involved, some landowners' accountants will argue it needs to be treated differently, closer to a joint venture or a licensing arrangement, depending on how the contract is worded. That distinction can shift how much of the income is exposed to different tax treatment, and it can also affect whether losses from the property, depreciation, maintenance, property tax can offset other income. Depreciation is where a lot of value gets left on the table. If Hank makes improvements to the land specifically for the tenant, grading, a paved lot, drainage work, lighting, fencing, those improvements can often be depreciated over a shorter schedule than the land itself, which never depreciates at all. Landowners who go into these deals without a real conversation with a CPA about how to structure the improvements, who pays for them, and who owns them at the end of the lease routinely leave thousands of dollars a year in avoidable tax exposure on the table. Lisa, Hank's accountant, put it bluntly during their first meeting. The difference between a lease drafted with tax strategy in mind and one drafted without it can be worth more, some years, than the difference between the flat rent and percentage rent options combined. Now the part that actually decides whether this whole arrangement is a smart investment or a slow-motion liability. First, zoning. Ron, the county zoning officer, has to sign off on commercial entertainment use for land that's currently zoned agricultural. That process alone typically takes 4 to 8 months, involves a public hearing, and requires notifying every neighboring property owner within a set radius. If a single neighbor shows up at that hearing with a strong objection, traffic, noise, property values, moral concerns about a nightlife venue near a rural community, the whole rezoning request can die in committee, and Hank would have spent months and often several $1,000s in application and legal fees for nothing. Second, liability. The moment a nightclub opens on your land, you are exposed to a category of legal risk most landowners have never dealt with in their lives. Fights that start inside the venue and spill into the parking lot. Drunk driving incidents involving someone who was served at the club and crashed leaving the property. Liquor liability claims. Noise ordinance violations that can result in fines against the property owner, not just the operator, depending on how local ordinances are written. Most landowners assume the club's business insurance covers all of this automatically. It doesn't, not for the landowner specifically, unless the lease explicitly requires the operator to name the landowner as an additional insured party on their general liability and liquor liability policies. A significant number of these leases, drafted casually between two parties who trust each other, skip that clause entirely, and the landowner doesn't find out it's missing until the first lawsuit names them personally. Third, property value and future flexibility. Once land is rezoned and built out for nightlife use, paved lots, commercial electrical service, sound-related structural modifications, it becomes harder, not easier, to sell it back into residential or agricultural use later. Some buyers see commercial zoning as a value add. Many potential residential buyers see a former nightclub site and walk away entirely. The landowner has effectively locked that parcel into a new identity, and reversing that decision if the lease ever ends and the arrangement doesn't get renewed can be its own expensive project. And there's a fourth cost that's easy to underestimate: the relationship cost. Big Mike, Hank's nearest neighbor, has lived next to that field for 20 years. The first 6 months of the lease were tense, headlights sweeping across his property at 1 a.m., bass audible from his back porch on weekend nights, cars occasionally parking along the shoulder of the road near his driveway. None of that shows up in a spreadsheet, but it shows up in every conversation Hank has with his neighbor from that point forward. And in more than a few cases across the country, it's shown up in actual lawsuits over nuisance claims. Let's compare Hank's 3 realistic options on that exact same 11-acre plot, because the honest comparison is more interesting than most people expect. Option 1, keep farming it. After equipment costs, fuel, seed, fertilizer, and the physical labor involved, Hank's realistic net income from active farming on that parcel is around $8,000 a year, and that number depends heavily on weather and commodity prices that he has zero control over. Option 2, lease it for solar development. Solar developers have been actively targeting exactly this kind of edge-of-town parcel for the last several years. The offer on the table was $1,000 an acre annually, roughly $11,000 to $12,000 a year across the property, locked in for a 25-year term, with essentially no landowner risk once the panels are installed. No liability exposure, no zoning fights beyond the initial approval, no tenant relationship to manage. It's the lowest effort, lowest risk option on the table, and also the lowest ceiling. Option 3, the Nightclub deal. A guaranteed floor around $30,000 a year from the percentage structure with its minimum and realistic upside into the $50,000 to $70,000 range in a strong year, with the tiered structure pushing even higher during peak months. On paper, this option outperforms the other two by a wide margin, 3 to 8 times the income of farming and 2.5 to 6 times the income of the solar lease. But raw numbers without context are misleading. Farming carries weather risk, but no liability exposure and no relationship strain with neighbors. Solar carries almost no risk at all, which is exactly why the return is capped so low. The market prices risk accurately. The Nightclub carries real legal exposure, real reputational exposure, real relationship costs with the surrounding community, and real tenant default risk if the business doesn't survive. The higher return isn't free money. It's compensation for genuinely taking on more risk than the other two options, and that risk has to be actively managed, not just accepted. It's also worth noting how much these numbers shift by region, because the same 11 acres produce very different outcomes depending on where they sit. Near a major metro, in a market with real disposable nightlife spending, gross revenue at a comparable venue can run 2 to 3 times higher than in Hank's smaller regional market, which pushes a 6% lease cut well past 6 figures annually in a strong year. But that same metro market comes with far more competition for suitable land, tighter zoning scrutiny, and higher insurance premiums that operators will often try to negotiate the landowner into partially absorbing. In smaller markets, land is cheaper and zoning fights are less intense, but the revenue ceiling is lower, and a single competing venue opening nearby can meaningfully cut into an existing club's numbers and, by extension, the landowner's percentage. There is no universal number here. Every one of these deals has to be evaluated against the specific market the land sits in, not against a case study from a different town. Nightlife venues carry one of the highest early failure rates of any small business category. And that statistic matters enormously to a landowner, because when the tenant fails, the landowner is the one left holding a parking lot built for a business that no longer exists. Consider a different landowner, in a different state, who leased a comparable parcel for a flat $3,000 a month with none of the protective clauses Hank eventually negotiated. His tenants club opened strong, drew good crowds for the first year, and then lost its liquor license after a string of underage service violations. The business folded within 14 months, owing 4 months of back rent that the LLC simply never paid, because the LLC had no assets and the operator had signed nothing personally. The landowner was left with a parking lot full of cracked asphalt, abandoned bar equipment, a disconnected but still installed sound system, and a $40,000 bill to clear and restore the site before he could lease it to anyone else, solar developer, farmer, or otherwise. 5 years of lease income at that flat rate wouldn't have covered that cleanup bill, let alone the legal costs of trying and failing to collect the back rent from a dissolved company. Compare that to a landowner in a growing suburb outside Nashville who leased a similar parcel to an established regional nightlife group with a track record of successful venues. That operator had the leverage to negotiate favorable terms for themselves, but the landowner still insisted on and received a personal guarantee from the group's principal owner. Mandatory additional insured status renewed every year without exception, and a security deposit equal to 4 months' rent held specifically for restoration costs. When that venue eventually closed after a successful 6-year run, not from failure, but because the operator sold the business and the new buyer wanted a different location, the landowner's deposit and the orderly transition covered nearly the entire cost of preparing the land for its next use. The difference between those two outcomes wasn't luck. And it wasn't really about how reputable the tenant seemed at signing. It was 4 specific clauses in the lease, negotiated before either landowner had any idea whether their tenant would succeed or fail. Clause 1. A personal guarantee from the operator individually, not just from the LLC or corporation running the club, so that if the business folds, the landowner isn't left chasing an empty shell company for unpaid rent and damages. Clause 2. Mandatory additional insured status on the operator's general liability and liquor liability insurance policies, with proof of renewal required annually, not just at signing. Clause 3. An early termination penalty steep enough that walking away from the lease costs the operator meaningfully more than simply finishing out the term, which discourages casual abandonment the moment business softens. Clause 4. A security deposit sized specifically to cover realistic restoration costs. Not a token amount, but a figure based on an actual estimate of what it costs to clear a commercial nightlife site and return it to a leasable condition. Skip any one of these four, and the landowner is gambling on the tenant's competence and integrity with no backstop. Include all four, and the landowner has converted an unpredictable risk into a bounded, insurable, contractually protected one, without giving up any of the upside that made the deal attractive in the first place. Here's what most first-time landowners get wrong before they even reach the lease clause conversation. They negotiate from a position of assumed weakness when in most markets they're actually negotiating from a position of real strength. Land suitable for nightlife use, the right size, the right zoning potential, the right distance from residential density, the right highway access, is genuinely scarce in most markets. Operators like Nadia don't have dozens of comparable sites to choose from. They typically have 2 or 3 realistic options in any given metro area, and every one of those sites comes with its own trade-offs. That scarcity is leverage, and it means landowners can and should negotiate harder than instinct tells them to. Before agreeing to any number, a landowner should research comparable commercial land leases in the immediate area. Not residential rent comps, not general commercial rent comps, but specifically entertainment use and hospitality use land leases, which command a premium over standard commercial rates precisely because of the scarcity described above. Talking to a commercial real estate attorney or broker who specializes in hospitality and entertainment properties, even for a single paid consultation, routinely pays for itself many times over in the first year of a properly negotiated lease. It's also worth understanding what the operator's alternative actually is. Nadia's 90-day deadline to relocate wasn't Hank's problem to solve for free. It was leverage he could have used more aggressively than he did. Landowners with no time pressure of their own, negotiating against a tenant who does have a deadline, hold significantly more power in that conversation than most of them realize, and a surprising number leave that leverage on the table simply because they've never negotiated a commercial lease before and don't know what's normal to ask for. There's one more piece almost nobody plans for at the start of these deals, because it feels premature to think about an ending before the lease has even begun. What happens when it's over? One way or another. Commercial leases for land like this typically run 3 to 7 years, sometimes with renewal options built in. The smart move, which Hank's attorney insisted on, and Hank initially resisted because it felt unnecessary, is negotiating the terms of a potential ending at the exact same time as negotiating the beginning. While both sides are motivated to be reasonable, rather than after a relationship has soured or a business is failing. That means specifying in writing who owns any permanent improvements when the lease ends. The paving, the lighting, the drainage work, any structures built for the venue. It means specifying a defined restoration standard, not a vague promise to leave the property in good condition, but an actual description of what condition the land needs to be returned to, matched against that security deposit figure from earlier. And it means building in a right of first refusal or a clear renewal formula, so that if the club succeeds and both sides want to continue, the terms for year 8 aren't a complete renegotiation from scratch every single time, and so that if Hank ever wants to sell the underlying land, he knows exactly what obligations transfer to a new buyer and what don't. There's also the question of what happens if the operator wants to sell the business itself. Not fail, but sell the way the Nashville area landowner experienced. A well-drafted lease specifies whether the operator can assign the lease to a new owner without the landowner's approval, or whether any change of ownership requires the landowner to re-vet the new operator, reconfirm insurance, and potentially renegotiate terms. Landowners who skip this clause sometimes find themselves, without any say in the matter, suddenly leasing land to a completely different business than the one they originally agreed to, run by people they've never met and never approved. None of this is complicated to write into a lease. It's complicated only in the sense that it requires thinking at the start of an exciting new income opportunity about the version of this story where things don't go perfectly. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that separates the landowners who tell this story as a win years later from the ones who tell it as a cautionary tale. So here's how this actually played out for Hank with the real protective clauses in place. Year 1, $34,000 in lease income. One noise complaint, filed by a different neighbor 2 properties down, that cost Hank nothing personally because the lease explicitly made noise ordinance compliance the operator's contractual responsibility to resolve. Year 2, revenue climbed as the club built a regular weekend crowd, and Hank's cut hit $51,000. He now nets more from 4 of his 11 acres. The club only ended up needing 4, not the original 3, than he ever made working the entire property as farmland. But Hank isn't a lucky outlier. He's a protected one. The landowners who get burned by nightclub leases aren't, in most cases, the ones who took on the risk of a percentage structure or a nightlife tenant. They're the ones who took on that exact same risk without any of the paperwork designed to contain it, assuming a handshake and a friendly relationship with the tenant would be enough if something went wrong. If you're sitting on idle land near a growing town, close to highway access, far enough from dense residential neighborhoods to clear a realistic zoning review, this can be one of the highest yield uses of that land available to a private owner, genuinely outperforming farming, storage leasing, or even solar in the right location. But walking into it, you need to know, honestly, that the upside is real, the downside is real, and the entire gap between those two outcomes is decided by whether you negotiate 4 specific clauses that most landowners never think to ask for, because nobody ever explains in advance that they exist. The 11 acres behind Hank's house didn't change. The soil is the same soil his father tried to farm decades ago. What changed was the use, the contract, and the amount of thinking Hank was willing to do before signing anything. And that combination, more than any single number on this list, is the real economics of leasing your land to a nightclub.